sleepy this morning. I ain't bragging. But I guess we still need to start on this next section. We've won our independence. We established a new nation. And now what do we do? So we talked about this a little bit on Monday, that the government is set up as a confederation. Confederation just means it's a group that has come together. They're independent, but not independent. And it was made that way because there was a huge fear of a strong central government. So they didn't make a strong central government. They made a very weak central government. But they did manage, and you got to remember, this is done during the middle of the revolution. The Confederation, can't remember the word. My brain is turned off. The Articles of Confederation are put into effect before the war is over. So this government, while it was weak, still managed to survive. It managed to end the war. It set the principles of land distribution and territorial governments. And it did, towards the end, create some executive departments. Now, the executive was what they feared. So everything was run by committee. And I mean, there were hundreds of committees. And, you know, the founding fathers would serve on multiple committees. Like, well, I can't remember, I think it's Madison, served on over 80 committees, off and on throughout the time of the Articles of Confederation. But they did set up committees of foreign affairs, finance, a war office, each that had one head that answered to the rest of the Continental Congress. But it wasn't the most efficient government, but it's what they had. So under finance was probably one of the more, you know what? I am really asleep. Y'all need to say something. Come on, don't play the battery. Turn it off. Somebody left it on, so the batteries will be dead. I'll give y'all a second to catch up with that. And one of the things that the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation had going for it was they had very good leaders. You know, history is the history of humans. And sometimes it's the difference between what human you have in power as to how things go. You can have very good leaders who are very efficient and do very good things. You can have very bad leaders who take what would be a very workable situation and snatch victory, you know, snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. The Continental Congress had very good leaders. And one of them was Robert Morris. Robert Morris was the head of the Finance Committee. Can I flip slides? Morris believed in a coherent program of taxation and debt management. He believed that businessmen would be willing to invest in and support a government as long as they saw that that government paid off its debts. It didn't have to be debt-free, but it had to actively be paying off debts. And he couldn't wait until he could expand the government debt by issuing government bonds to pay the war debt. So he creates this cycle of indebtedness. But as long as you keep it at a low level and you're paying off your debts, it's healthy. You keep people are willing to invest. At least that was the plan. He also established the first national bank. It was the Bank of North America. It was established in 1871. It was partially private, but it was a bank that would hold all of the government funds. It would be able to loan money to the government, but also because it was in part privately owned, it would still make a profit for its investors. But by having one bank that the government could bank with, having the money in one central location made it easier for Morris and the people in the finance to get things done. Before the Bank of America, you had accounts in different places, which, you know, makes it a little more difficult to keep track of everything. One of the issues, or almost a crisis for the country, that came up with Robert Morris and others in the financial area was called the Newburgh conspiracy. I will wake up, I promise. The Army was encamped at Newburgh, New York during the last winter of the war. Most of the officers had gone without pay for some time. There was a fear among them that they would never see that pay, nor would they see the land bonuses that Congress promised them. So we're almost to the end of the war. We really don't know that, but we're almost to the end of the war. You have this group of disgruntled officers, and they propose a military coup. One of them is Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton decides that he needs to get Washington on their side, tries to talk Washington, or thinks he has talked Washington into joining the group. But Washington, so that they're all going to meet and discuss exactly how they're going to accomplish this coup and overthrow the Continental Congress to make sure they get their pay. Washington is not on board with this. And in a single, very moving speech, dresses them all down as cowards and as traitors. And while he understands, and he probably did understand, he says he understands, and he probably did understand where they were coming from, he went without pay for the entire war. He did. That was one of his conditions upon being commander-in-chief, was that he would not get paid. He did sympathize with them, but he points out that this coup would kill our country. And they said by the end of his speech, there were people in tears, and the conspiracy never follows through. But I bring it up to show you that not all is well in this new country. There are tensions. And it takes good leaders to calm those down. The other area that, and probably the more important area, that the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederate under the Articles of Confederation did really well was land policy. Once they have won the war and the boundaries have been established, it becomes established within Congress that lands not included within the boundaries of the 13 original colonies, so all that western land, because Britain recognized our western boundary as the Mississippi, all that western land became the public domain. It now belongs to the federal government. And that's a big question. What do you do with all that? Part of it is potentially going to have to go to the soldiers that they promised land bonuses to. But it's also probably one of the only areas that the Continental Congress could actually raise money. They can sell the land to settlers to fill the coffers, because remember, they can't tax effectively. There's really no way for, under the Articles of Confederation, for the federal government to raise money. So as early as 1779, they determined that they were not going to treat this new land as colonies, but they would treat them as future states. That's a big departure from what is going on in the world. All the major countries, when they take new land, treat it as a colony. That's what Britain does. That's what France does. That's what Spain does. But we're not going to do that. And between 1874 and 1877, the policies are created that are going to guide the settlement across the nation. And they're going to set a precedent. I mean, they're talking about very specific areas when they do this, but it's going to set the precedent that's going to take us all the way across the Pacific. Jefferson is the first. The first land policy was put forth in 1784. His was the most simple. It stated that when the population of an area reached the population of the smallest state, that territory could be a state. At that point, they could vote an assembly, write a constitution, elect a governor, and they would be a state. Pretty simple, pretty easy. The next year, however, the Land Ordinance of 1785 is passed that sets up a survey system. If you ever look at a map and you look at the easternmost states, they're all funky shaped. And some of the western ones are too, but once you get past the Mississippi, you get a lot more straight lines. One, there's not as many rivers out there to use as boundaries, but also they start surveying. And it's easier to go latitude and longitude than it is, some weird river that's going to change its course. And rivers do change their course, and borders change. So they start this first in the Northwest Territory. Now, the states in the Northwest Territory do end up being a little funky shaped, but within the states, they survey and make 6-mile townships. So that means you've got 6 miles on each side. So a town would be 36 square miles, right? 6 times 6 is 36. Each township was divided into 36 sections. So farmers out there, y'all know a section is 640 acres. This is where we get that. These sections are to be sold at no less than $1 an acre. Now, most common people are not going to have $640 to plop down on a section of land. Not only that, in 1785, farming was not advanced to the point where a family, a single family, could take care of 640 acres. So this plan favors land speculators. And Congress knew that. But they also wanted to fill their coffers. We've got to fill the treasury. Let's sell the land and get started. Now they did do one very forward-thinking thing. The income from the sale of the 16th section, so I guess they figured they needed 15 sections worth of money first. That money was set aside for schools. So each township would have, in theory, could have a school using that $640 that came from the sale of that 16th section. Why they picked the 16th, I don't know. Why they didn't just say one section, will be set aside, but they specified. So the area we're talking about right now is the Northwest Territory. So it's Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. It's these states. Yes, they're funky shaped, but they're actually gridded up within. That's the first section that they sell. Okay, that's not the section I just talked about. That's the next section we're going to talk about. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787. They did designate that there would be 5 states, and there are 5 states in that little area. That's actually a big area. And rather than go with Jefferson's very simplistic idea of when you get to the size of the smallest state, you can become a state, Congress put a few more stipulations on it. There was a period of preparation before you could get to statehood. When a territory was laid out, they laid out these 5 territories. Each was to start with a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges, all appointed by Congress. So kind of treating it like a colony, but it's not. It's a territory. When the population of that area got to 5,000, those 5,000 people could choose an assembly. That assembly would pick 10 names to submit to Congress, of which to choose a governor. Both the governor and Congress had veto power. They did exclude slavery permanently from this Northwest Territory. Slavery is starting to fade. We'll get to that. At this point, all of the states except for Georgia and South Carolina have stopped importing slaves. That doesn't mean slavery has stopped. It just means they're not buying any new slaves from Africa. They're relying on natural increase. Some states had actually ended slavery or picked a date by which to end it. Vermont had ended it in 1777, Massachusetts in 1780, Rhode Island in 1784, New York, which, if y'all remember, was one of the bigger slave states in the North. They labeled, the law is written in 1799, but slaves would still be slaves until July 4th, 1827. That was going to be the date of freedom in New York. And that was a compromise to allow slave owners that had very young children that were slaves to recoup their investment. So you have this preparation. Once the area gets to 60,000, they can write a state constitution. They would include bills of rights, the basic ones that everybody else did: religion, representation, trial by jury, common law. Ohio is going to be the first state that becomes a state under this plan, but then the others, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, are going to follow suit. And the states were admitted as equals to Congress. They were new states, but they had just as many rights and representatives as, say, Rhode Island, that had been a state for a long time. And it's working. People are settling. The coffers are starting to fill, but Congress is very desperate for money. They don't have a good way to raise it. And a group of Army officers comes forward as the Ohio Company of Associates and makes Congress an offer. So they're looking at the land west of the Ohio River. And they offer Congress $1 million in certificates of indebtedness for 1.5 million acres. So rather than getting $1 an acre, you're getting 75 cents an acre, if I did my math right. So Congress is getting a little bit less per acre, but what they're getting is freedom from debt, because these Army officers have collected basically IOUs that the government owes them and says, hey, we'll turn these in exchange for this land. And then that group becomes basically a speculator group. They're going to turn around and sell it to farmers because they can sell, you know, a common person might could buy 80 acres, 160 acres, and deal with that, but you can't deal with 640. So you get a land speculator. So say they pay 75 cents an acre, then they turn around and they sell it for $1 an acre. And they make a profit. And the common person can get an amount of land that they can deal with. And settlement starts. The area south of the Ohio River filled pretty rapidly, which was a problem in some areas because the Indians were still there. So one thing I didn't say at the beginning of this is Congress did actually try to make sure Indian claims to the land were extinguished before they started surveying. That's why they start in the north with the Northwest Territory, because a lot of those Indian tribes had either lost their land in the first Treaty of Paris or had made settlements with the United States when it became a state. Not so much in the South. The Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Creek, those Indians were not quite ready to get out of the way. But they do negotiate some treaties. The Treaty of Stanwix in 1784 pushes the Iroquois to cede their western lands in New York and Pennsylvania. The Treaty of Hopewell in 1785 pushed the Cherokee out of a lot of their territory. They're out of South Carolina. They lose much of their land in North Carolina, and they lose most of Kentucky and Tennessee, and they're pretty much pushed into northern Georgia. And they will kind of make a stand there. Now, they do negotiate with the United States for recognition, and they get it as, you know, recognition as a separate country, and they sort of get it. We don't give them their land back, and we don't recognize that we basically don't tell them that, or we don't recognize that they own Georgia. You know, it's still part of our state, but they're controlling it, so it's okay. And then, so that, we will deal with that when Jackson comes to office, and that's one of, in my opinion, one of our lower moments as a country. But we'll get there. But they do manage to successfully get settlements started. And we're starting to fill up that area going to the Mississippi. In the areas of trade and economy, Congress really had very little to do with success or failure. A lot of this is just a natural bust boom cycle that you have during wars. Certain people do really well during wars. Farmers that are not actively involved in, like, they're not fighting on your farm. If you can farm and you're raising food, you're going to do okay because Army needs to be fed. You can provide uniforms. There's a lot of things that get sustained throughout the war because the war effort needs the money. But then when it ends, you're going to have a depression. A lot of, and they did have a rough economic time right after the war. A lot of it had to do with leaving Great Britain. Some of it was war disruption, like sending cotton out of the South was disrupted. Tobacco, not cotton, tobacco. We're starting cotton. We haven't gotten very far. But cash crops that Britain needs are disrupted. Commercial endeavors, obviously, we're not trading with Britain during the war. All of that gets disrupted. The British West Indies get officially closed to us, but it doesn't take that long before the economy recovers. Even though the British West Indies are closed officially, we haven't forgotten how to smuggle, so that's not a huge impediment. And pretty soon after the war, by 1887, the seaports are thriving again. They found new markets. The Dutch, the Swiss, Prussia, Morocco, Africa, Asia. The big one was China. Someone sails around South America and goes up to China with American goods and comes back with a load of Chinese goods, and everybody's happy. You have tea, you have spices, you have silks, all of these wonderful trade goods that normally would have come through Britain, through the East India Company, through middlemen, and then had the cost jacked up. Now we're trading directly with China and Asia. And Britain comes back on. Britain will, I mean, money talks. They need raw supplies. They want to sell their goods. And, you know, trade picks back up. Diplomacy, however, Congress did have a lot to do with and didn't do very well. Part of it is we're small in a, or maybe no, we're not small. We're a big, we do cover a lot of land. but we're young. We're a young country. We haven't been around very long. And we're dealing with very well established countries. The British, while they said they were pulling out, keep military posts in Canada, right along our border, right along the Great Lakes. And they conspire with the Indians along that border to keep the unrest going. You know, raid that settlement. We'll pay you for all the scalps. Their excuse for doing this was we hadn't paid our debts to all the British merchants that we owed. To which most of the patriots said, well, then why the heck did we fight a war? You know, sorry, you're not getting paid. They also had raised issues of loyalist property. By 1787, all of the states had rescinded any laws that they had passed against loyalists. And most had allowed loyalists like a 12-month period where they could come back unmolested and either wrap up their affairs or decide that they want to stay on their property. Now, that's not to say it all went smoothly. There were still loyalists harassed and even lynched after the war. But they do make an effort and they do rescind all the laws against loyalists. But it wasn't enough to make Great Britain happy. Besides that, Great Britain is pissed that they lost to this brand new little country. They got beat. They are probably at this point the strongest nation in the world, and we won. You know, it was the David versus Goliath thing, and they aren't real happy about that. Spain is the other real problem for the new Americans. They have an issue with the southern border and also with the Mississippi River. We look at the southern border at the 31st parallel. That's about where the Florida Panhandle is. They want it to be the Yazoo River, which is the 32nd parallel, so a little bit higher. So we're disputing that area. They also feel like they should be in control of the Mississippi River. And the river is the boundary. And theoretically, the boundary line runs down the middle of the river. Remember that thing I told you about rivers change courses? Parts of the boundary, when you get down in Louisiana, are only in Spanish territory. So Spain controls that. That's an issue because we're now got people living out here in Illinois, Wisconsin, Kentucky, that goes all the way over there, and Tennessee that goes all the way over to the Mississippi, that are raising goods and they want to send them down the river. Corn is one of the big issues. If you raise corn, there's a couple of things you can do with it. You can sell it as human food. You can sell it as animal food. Or you can distill it into whiskey and sell it as liquor. Of those three choices, whiskey is the most stable. If you're going to sell it as feed for humans or animals, you got to keep it dry. You're dealing with large, bulky containers. If you distill it, it's not going to go bad. And it's in these nice little compact jugs that you can stack and send down the river. But if you can't get all the way to the Gulf, where you can load it on big ships that can swing it around and either take it across the ocean or up to the colonies or the new states, you really aren't getting very far. Spain also encouraged unrest along the border with the Indians and even among their settlers. They encouraged their settlers to kind of push back against the border. So these are basically, or these are some of the problems that the Confederation, and we've talked about a lot of them. The economy is the big issue for most people. You know, the Mississippi being closed, that only affects people on the western border. Most people are not concerned. The forts along the Great Lakes, that's a problem for those Northwest Territory people. That's not a big problem. The economy is a big problem. And there's a lot of issues that go into this. There's a shortage of coinage. There's been a shortage of coinage in the United States ever since it was a colony. Hard coin, gold, and silver are hard to come by. The natural reaction to that is print paper money. And they're going to try that. In 1875, as to quell this demand for paper money, several states began issuing it. Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, South Carolina, Rhode Island, Georgia, North Carolina, they all start issuing paper money. Some do very, very well. Pennsylvania, they made good on their paper money. There was not an issue there. Rhode Island went absolutely nuts. Inflation goes sky high in Rhode Island. They just print more money, which makes your inflation go even higher. And the people who want paper money are basically the indebted farmers, because paper money causes inflation, which means the amount you're paying off is now, technically you're paying off the same amount, but the value of it is less. I am not an economist. A lot of this I don't understand, but that I do understand. But it becomes an issue because different states do different things. And if you have money from Pennsylvania, it's not necessarily going to be accepted in New York. Now, Pennsylvania's probably was because they were doing well. But if you were in New York and somebody tried to pay you off with Rhode Island currency, they'd laugh at you. Why would you take something that's totally useless? It's useless in its own state. So you have different levels of success with that. There was also a great lack of uniformity. Congress couldn't pass tariffs, but the states could. So the states tried to protect their local interest. So say you had a bunch of silversmiths in your state. You're going to pass a high import tariff on silver goods so that if you import them, you have to pay more for them. Therefore, you have to sell them at a higher rate, and the local people can sell theirs at a lower rate. And it keeps your local businesses going. And you're a shipper. So I'm a shipper, and I have a load of silver. Pots and pans and tea sets and all that good stuff. And I'm coming in, and I'm heading for Massachusetts. And I find out that Massachusetts has a 30% tariff on silver goods. But I also find out that Rhode Island has a 10% tariff on silver goods. What am I going to do? I'm going to go to Rhode Island. this lack of uniformity messed with all of the states. And it kind of made us look like idiots, to the outside world. One country should have one uniform tax system. And all of these things were affecting the economy. One of the bigger problems in the economy was, and this goes back to the paper money, was Shays' Rebellion. I said paper money had created chaos in Rhode Island. There was two in Massachusetts. There was too little paper money and too much taxation. So they hadn't actually printed enough or issued enough to ease the situation. They only aggravated it. Massachusetts was a very conservative state. They were levying high taxes because they're conscientious and they want to pay off their war debts. And all of this fell the hardest on the farmers and the poor. And in 1780, the legislation adjourned without doing anything about it. They issued no relief for these poor farmers. So, under the leadership of Daniel Shays, angry farmers closed courts, prevented foreclosures, because that's what happens when you can't pay your debts. They foreclose on your farm, they kick you out. It's a cycle you'll see over and over. And then he gathered up 1,200 men and marched on the Springfield Arsenal with the intention of gaining the arms there and taking over the Massachusetts government. What they wanted was a more flexible monetary system. They wanted to be able to pay their debts with corn and produce. If you're not going to issue enough money, we can't get enough coin, let us pay with what we have. We have cabbages. We'll pay with cabbages. We'll pay with corn. Then you can sell it and do what you want, but we can't sell it and get enough coin to pay you back. They wanted to postpone paying the taxes until the post-war agricultural depression was over. The state responds by sending out the militia, a little over 4,000 or 4,400, with cannons to face off these 1,200 farmers. They fire a volley. They leave 4 farmers dead. And that's pretty much the end of it. The farmers do win. They scare the legislature enough that they eliminate some of the taxes on the farmers. But the big result of Shays' Rebellion is this fear that, okay, maybe a republic isn't going to work completely. Maybe we can't rely on the virtue of all of the citizens to put their self-interest aside for the greater good. And you get this strong push towards conservatism, but you also get this push towards nationalism at the same time. And people start seeing that maybe tyranny doesn't just come from a monarch or a dictator. Maybe tyranny can come in the form of mobs that try to take over your government. So Shays' Rebellion scares a lot of people, and they start calling for a stronger government. Calls start being made for a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Because if we can't trust everybody to act in the best interest, maybe we need to make a few more rules that outline how this is all going to be. All right, we will stop there. We will talk about the new Constitution when we come back.
Is the whiskey bone in your nose at all? Oh, okay.
Oh,
That one, I have like the flag of it and everything in my room.
cool.
That's like, I like the flag and things that I think are cool. So like, if I don't know the story behind it, it's kind of like, so I had to learn it.
Yeah.
But
It
anyway,
may come up later, but it's not something I dwell on.
it's not really a huge event
Yeah.
in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. But that's cool.
I went there.
All right. Brian.
So,
1 second. I want to.